ORDA Science Webinar 101 Series, Opportunities and Challenges for Considering Pollinators and Their Ecosystem Services in NRDA on November 9, 2023 at 1901 Universal Time by James R. Meldrum, Research Economist, U.S. Geological Survey, Fort Collins Science Center, recorded and organized by Samantha Foster and Microsoft Teams. Slide includes the USGS Science for a Changing World logo. The findings and conclusions in the webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of DOI's NRDAR program, the department including the trustee bureaus, or the United States, although some of the presenters may be employees of government agencies. The ideas described herein do not reflect the policies of those agencies, and no official endorsement should be inferred on NRDAR. Contact Samantha Forster to be added to the distribution list at Samantha_Foster at ios.doi.gov.
So, hello everyone. My name is Samantha Foster. I am with the Office of Restoration and Damage Assessment. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar about pollinators. I am going to give a brief bio for our speaker, and then I will hand it over to James. All right. So our speaker today is James Meldrum. James is a research economist with the USGS Fort Collins Science Center in Colorado. James investigates natural resource decisions in numerous contexts, including fuels and fire management, ecosystem restoration, electricity generation, and the management of invasive species in forest and sagebrush ecosystems. James has a PhD in environmental economics from the University of Colorado Boulder and a BS in physics from Washington University in St. Louis. All right, James, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so you can pull your slides back up.
All right.
And I'll go ahead and let you know when I see those. All right, I can see yours, so I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off and turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Samantha, for the introduction. Thank you, Tim Hosel, for inviting me to give this talk today. And of course, thank you all for attending this talk. So today I'm discussing opportunities and challenges for considering pollinators and their ecosystem services in NRDAR. So I want to start off by acknowledging that we know that pollinators are very important. This is something that kind of raises the top of mind when you start talking about pollinators. Is particularly today we hear a lot in the news and the media and advertisements talking about how important pollinators are, and I want to start off just acknowledging that from the get-go. Some basic facts. So a study by Stephanie Chrisman published in 2019 estimated that 87% of all flowering plants depend on pollinators. And she used this as advancing the argument that really means that ultimately pollinators support basically all ecosystem services to some extent. And I've taken this a little bit further. 75% of food crops and 35% of crop production volume worldwide has been estimated as depending on pollinators. Putting in an economic context, domestic honeybees have been estimated to contribute about $14 billion to U.S. crop production. And insect pollination is worth about $180 billion for world agriculture. These are large numbers. Obviously, a lot of people have looked at this and seen, clearly pollinators play an important role in our society, particularly when we think about food and agriculture. It's also important to note, even though a lot of the media and kind of the social media branding around things is focusing on honeybees, it's not just domestic honeybees who are pollinators. The list of pollinators includes wild bees. These are actually estimated to be the main pollinator in non-crop settings in terms of the amount of pollen. There's flies, there's wasps. The picture on the background here is actually a bee that mimics, or a fly that mimics a bee. There's wasps. Pollinators are frequently invoked, or butterflies are frequently invoked as a pollinator. Even though they carry very little pollen, they do play a role as pollinators. Beetles are known to be important in tropical regions, even though they receive less attention in more temperate latitudes. Moths Bats, approximately 6% of mammal species, primarily bats, are pollinators, and hummingbirds. So approximately 10% of bird species are pollinators. So this is just to point out that, it's not just honeybees. Yes, they are a major pollinator out there, but there's a lot of species out doing this important work of pollination. So starting at that background and that context, a small team of us assembled to start thinking about this a little bit more deeply. What can we do with this information? And in particular, can we apply it to a context like NRDAR? So the work that I'm presenting today is not just mine. So I'm James Meldrum. I'm a research economist. I have a background in non-market valuation, which is essentially trying to figure out the dollar values associated with things, usually natural resources, that are not traded on markets. So people don't buy and sell them, but they're still valuable. What is the value to that? That's where my background comes from. Our small team also includes Diane Larson, who's a research wildlife biologist at the USGS Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center. And Diane was our team's expert on focusing on the contaminants and the kind of toxicology related to pollinators. Then we have Tim Hosel, who I believe many of you probably know is the Deputy Director of the DOI Office of Restoration and Damage Assessment. And then Joe Ellen Hink, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment and Restoration, or NRDAR coordinator for the USGS Natural Hazards Mission Area. And Joe Ellen was really the one who assembled our team and got us all thinking in this area. And so our small team a few years ago just started asking, okay, so knowing that pollinators are important, what does the literature say about the effects of contaminants on pollinators? And what does it say about the value of ecosystem services associated with pollinators? So after putting some time and digging in, we eventually published this paper that was published a few months ago in Integrated Environmental Assessment and Management. And this is the paper that is kind of the background that I'm talking about today. And our bullet point conclusion from this is that actionable information in this context really is pretty limited due to gaps in understanding of both natural and social systems. But we don't want us to stop there. We think that there's a lot of important points to be discussed, and hopefully these are things that are going to come out in the discussion later today. This is not the first time, or not the only time I'll be showing the link to the paper, and that's because, this being an hour-long seminar and this being a review paper, there's a lot of details that I'm not going to get into. So here and at other points, I'm going to defer you to the paper if you'd like to dive in and see more of the details. So the first step that we took when we were thinking about this problem is to really think about, okay, what is the interaction between contaminants and pollinators? So clearly from the get-go, this is an interdisciplinary problem. We have to be thinking about exposure, toxicology, things like that. We also have to be thinking about ecology and biology. So kind of at the basic level, if you have a contaminant out in the environment, say from an oil spill or from some industrial release, something like that, how is that related to pollinators? At the basic level, you can have a direct interaction where there's the contamination in the environment, and then there's biological uptake by some pollinator species. And then that uptake has some sort of effect that influences the pollinator. And it could influence the pollinator in terms of that diversity of species that are available, the abundance within any individual species, or actually even not thinking about just lethal effects, but sublethal effects, changes in behavior of that pollinator species. These are all different things that could be affected by the contaminant. But it doesn't stop just there, because of course pollinators are, by nature of being pollinators, it's really important to think about them within the broader food web. So the pollinator species, they play an important role of pollinating plants. And so there's interactions between the pollinators and plant communities. And then, of course, like any other species, pollinators are preyed on by other things that are trying to eat them. So there's interactions within the broader food web, kind of going in different directions. But all of these different interactions play an important role for understanding how that contaminant might be affecting things down the line. And then for one further complication is the recognition that there might be not just this direct line from the contaminant going to the pollinator species, but of course, there could also be these more indirect effects. So anytime there's a biological uptake by, say, a predator of a predator species that preys on a pollinator species, or biological uptake by plants that are used by the pollinator species, these are also indirect mechanisms that contaminant could be affecting the pollinator. And so the point here is that we map this all out because this conceptual model helps us develop a richer understanding of what really is kind of the context of contaminants in pollinator species, and how can those two be interacting in ways that might have implications for people and the resources or the benefits that we get from the ecosystem services. So the first step after we built this part of the conceptual model is to say, okay, what can we find in the academic literature that helps, lay out these connections? And so this is where, the first time where, again, I'll really refer you back to the paper, because there's a lot more details that I can cover here. And also I'll be the first to say that as a research economist, I'll very quickly get out of my depth in this area. But broadly, that we were taking a view of this literature, and it's very interdisciplinary because it involves looking at exposure, but also relationships within food webs, those dynamics, thinking about not just exposure, but also effects. And I think that's a really important point to think about within this context. So we split the literature review between invertebrates and vertebrates, and focusing first on the invertebrates, primarily insect species, we find that the research really does focus on honeybees. So there's some evidence for other species in terms of exposure, but not really much evidence for the routes of that exposure, or importantly, the effects. So it's not enough to just know that something was exposed, but what does that mean for the species? Does it relate to those changes in things like abundance, diversity, behavioral patterns? So there is a fair amount of evidence, or there is evidence that suggests the indirect exposure via floral resources is really the primary pathway for exposure to things like metals. So this is important. Again, thinking about those indirect pathways, they're really a pretty important pathway for getting a contaminant from the environment into the pollinator species. So it's not just direct exposure, but that indirect pathway going through the floral resources. That said, it's important to note that there's such a great variety in life history strategies among insects that it really makes generalization pretty difficult. You can get this even with a single species. If you think of a butterfly, when it's in the caterpillar stage versus the butterfly stage, it's going to have very different behaviors and very different potential pathways for exposure, as well as how that might affect behavior. So there's a lot of variety there, and again, it makes generalization fairly difficult. That said, when we move over to vertebrates, there's even less known. So there's comparatively little research on exposure and effects for vertebrate pollinators. So exposure to, for example, pesticides or metals has been measured for bats and hummingbirds. So there is evidence that contaminants out there in the environment are somehow exposing these species, but studies of the physiological, biological, or ecological effects of exposure are lacking. And again, not to dwell on this point, but I think it's pretty important in this context. Exposure tells us just that, but it's important to know also the lethal effects or mortality, as well as sublethal effects such as any behavioral changes, specifically particularly when you're talking about a pollinator species. If that behavioral change affects the pollination habits, it can really have downstream effects that can be quite broad and really propagate across an ecosystem. So to recap the highlights from the review of the ecotoxicology and ecology, pollinating animals can likely be exposed to environmental contaminants, particularly by feeding on floral nectar or pollen. But overall, we have limited understanding of the environmental and biotic factors that contribute to variation in exposure and effects. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the ecosystem services side. So ecosystem services as a concept really captured imaginations just a few decades ago as a way to help people understand the importance of things that intuitively we all know are really important. Things like clean air, fresh water, and indeed pollinators. But as an economist, it's not particularly meaningful, let alone actionable, to talk about the total value of something, like the value of all the pollinators in the world, for example. Some of those high-level statistics that I showed on one of the first slides, they're good for capturing attention, but they're not particularly actionable in a lot of sense. So as an economist, I like to talk a lot about marginal impacts. And simply this means relatively small changes that don't lead to a reordering of social or ecological systems, but really what happens when there's a small change. So a few species are changed or a small area is affected. What is the impact of that on society? And these are things that not only is it kind of more, we can get our hands around it a little bit more, but also it tends to be more actionable and has information that can be folded into decision making or policies and that type of context. Oh, actually, I should go back real quick. So what I'm showing here is the way that we understand these impacts, and it often in the ecosystem services context, people build these causal chains, and these causal chains are a way to conceptually link from some sort of action, and that could be an action by people, or it could be a change in an ecosystem, a change from baselines, and then how that propagates through to things that people care about. So there's the action that has an effect on the ecosystem. So in the case of the contaminants, like we were just talking about, contaminant release going through to exposure, going through to some sort of effect on the pollinator species, whether it's direct or indirect. And then this links to an ecosystem service. This is something that provides things to people. And this can be then translated into a benefit. And the benefit is the economics speak of actually the value that is provided by that service. And really a lot of the difference between a service and a benefit comes down to the users. So recognizing how do people use this, what do they value, or how much do they value this service that is being provided? That's the benefit that society gets from the ecosystem service. And so to talk about the values, particularly in an ecosystem service context, it's important to understand there's a few different aspects to this value. So for example, there's consumptive uses for things. So for a species living out in the wild, consumptive use, an example of that can be hunting the species. People hunt the species, they consume it, and that provides value to them. But there's also going to be non-consumptive use, for example, bird watching. When you're doing bird watching, the person doing the bird watching is deriving some sort of benefit or value from that experience, but it doesn't affect the bird itself, depending on how it's done, of course. But in the pure example, it's a non-consumptive use because it doesn't affect the species, but people still get the value from it. Those two can be combined into use value. And then there's another category of existence value. And this is the value that the non-use value that people can derive from, or the benefit that derives from just knowing that the species is out there. And an existence value is isolated from any experience that people might have with a species. This often comes up with threatened and endangered species or charismatic species that might live on different continents that people care about, even though they're not going to interact with it. And kind of the core from the economics perspective is that this is meaningful value. If people are willing to make trade-offs in their own lives in some way to, say, protect these species, that is a way that they can demonstrate this value that they hold for that. And it shows that this is a real benefit that people get from the existence of the species. So these are two are combined to a concept that we like to call total economic value, that is not to be confused with, say, the the value of a total amount of something. So it's not saying the total value of all species out there, but it's the total value that we assign to, say, a certain amount of a species being out there. And then finally, one more concept in kind of the conceptual side of value. These are all examples, for the most part, of different types of non-market values. So these are benefits that come from things that are not traded on markets. And therefore, we need these specialized non-market valuation techniques if we want to quantify the benefits. But of course, if we're saying non-market values, there's also the converse. And so there are market values. And these are, for example, marketable products like food or raw materials. And the value of those can be estimated by looking at supply and demand relationships as revealed through market transactions and kind of the more conventional economics approaches that people often learn in their Econ 101 and courses like that. But those values also contribute to this concept of total economic value. There's different approaches to measuring them, but at the end of the day, they're all things that derive or are related to real benefits that people get going back to the ecosystem services. So one final piece of my quick primer here is some of the standard categorization. So one of the prime ways that people categorize ecosystem services goes back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment.
Provisioning services examples include food, fresh water, fuel wood, fiber, biochemicals, and genetic resources. Regulating service examples include climate regulation, disease regulation, water purification, and pollination. Cultural service examples include spiritual and religious, recreational and ecotourism, aesthetic, inspirational, educational, sense of place, and cultural heritage. Supporting service examples include soil formation, nutrient cycling, and primary production. Ecosystem services figure may be found at www.millenniumassessment.org/documents.300.aspx.pdf.
And so there's 4 main categories of these ecosystem services, and this is a way to conceptualize what people can get from the natural environment. So there's provisioning services, and these are products that are obtained from the ecosystems. Many of these are in the more market value or market values. So things like food, but also non-market things such as fresh water, genetic resources. Another category is regulating services. So these are benefits that are obtained from the regulation of ecosystem processes. So climate regulation, disease regulation, water regulation. Pollination is typically included under regulating services. And so these are things that are more, making the ecosystem function as the way that it is going to go. People can derive values from that. Next, there's cultural services. These are in the text of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. These are non-material benefits obtained from ecosystem services. And so this is a pretty broad category, includes spiritual and religious values, recreational and ecotourism opportunities, aesthetic benefits, educational benefits, more abstract things such as sense of place. In the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, these were called cultural services. Here in the context of this paper, we renamed these non-material services, deferring to the quick description there. And it's a bit of an awkward term, but we felt like it was an important, particularly in the NRDAR context, to differentiate from the more narrow conceptualization of cultural services, which pertains more specifically to things like cultural heritage and traditional practices. So in some frameworks, those cultural services are embedded within this broader category, which we here call non-material services. And finally, there's the category of supporting services in some frameworks. And these are services that are necessary for the production of other ecosystem services. Now, economists have generally moved away from focusing on supporting services per se, because when you want to talk about valuation, you want to be thinking about the final ecosystem services. And what that means is things that reach people. So supporting services, they're very important in terms of contributing to other services that people ultimately experience or enjoy, but they themselves are not inherently valuable. And so the way that they're embedded here is they're those indirect effects that I was talking about. The way that there might be indirect pathways from something happening to an outcome that people ultimately care about. That's really where the supporting services show up. So in our approach, we ultimately have 3 categories of ecosystem services, and that's what the next slide will be talking about.
The flowchart includes 4 category columns, including exposure, effects, ecology, and services. In exposure, the only item is contamination. Paths include contamination to biological uptake by predator species that prey on pollinator species, to predator species diversity, abundance, or behavior, to non-material services supporting appreciation, recreation, cultural practices, etc. The second path leads from contamination to biological uptake by pollinator species, to pollinator diversity, abundance, or behavior, to provisioning services providing for agricultural productivity or marketable products. The third path leads from contamination to biological uptake by plants used by pollinator species, to plant communities diversity, abundance, or characteristics, to regulating services, providing water resources, carbon sequestration.
So for that, we go back to the previous stage of the conceptual model. And so this is where we go from the ecotoxicology to the ecology, and really thinking about the broader picture of how a contamination out in the environment affects pollinator species, as well as their role within a broader interacting food web. And so from there, we can say, okay, how does this translate into services that ultimately provide benefits to people? And so the main category that we often see is these provisioning services. And so these are things that are, for example, provided for agricultural productivity or marketable products. And from here, we can see kind of that direct line. Pollinators, they are producing provisioning services because they are providing for the production of food, things like that. In this context, we presented this as a crosshatch box because it's important to recognize, going back to the point when we're talking about benefits and thinking about how we estimate the benefits, it matters who receives that benefit. And so when we're talking about agriculture, really what a lot of the provisioning services and what a lot of people are talking about with provisioning services is actually benefits that accrue to agricultural producers. Now, there are ways to link that into benefits that the general public has in public good context, but kind of at the first cut, there's a really important difference between the benefits that accrue to producers versus the benefits that accrue to the general public. And provisioning services typically are thought of as focusing, typically estimated as focusing on agricultural kind of as a commodity side. So the next category is these regulating services. So these are things like providing water resources, carbon sequestration. And where we really see this coming out for pollinators is not in the pollinators themselves, but the important role that they play in supporting and interacting with the plant communities. So that's where we'd expect regulating services to really come up as an important ecosystem service that is again, indirectly associated with pollinators. And finally, the third category, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment would have called the cultural services, but what we're calling here non-material services. And this includes the supporting appreciation, the recreation, cultural practices, a lot of these things that primarily exist in a non-market world, because there's not market transactions where people are buying and selling these things, but they still relate to real benefits that people get from these. So after we laid out this conceptual model, the next step we wanted to do is similar to what we did in the more biology and ecology side, is say, what does the literature really say about these? Thinking about the importance of marginal effects, the importance of specificity of going into specific ecosystems or specific contaminants, what can we really say in a more rigorous way? And so to support that, we conducted a structured literature review using the Web of Science. And so we had an abstract-based search for arguments reflecting economic valuation, different pollinators taxa, and the concept of, or the phrase ecosystem services somewhere within the full text of the study. So much of the headline results here we quickly found really coming from studies with, unfortunately, limited practical usefulness. And And they rely on methods that neglect important dynamics of the biological, environmental, or economic systems. They might tend to focus on overall pollination value to, say, an entire agricultural section of or sector for a country, or maybe even the entire world. And again, they typically focus on these benefits to agricultural producers rather than this public good. So that right off the bat, we quickly found some of these studies, including the studies that I was showing on the first slide, they're really good for catching attention. But if you're trying to use them in a more, applied sense of thinking about specific interactions, specific changes to an ecosystem, they tend to have fairly limited usefulness. So diving into the results of the literature review, the first thing we looked at was these provisioning services to agriculture, and particularly thinking about pollination supporting agricultural products. And we clearly saw this bar graph here is just showing the number of studies that we found. Most studies on provisioning services report the returns to agriculture from pollination by bees. Most of these are actually honeybees, not all, but that really is where the bulk of the studies are. So 65 sources we found. We saw a handful talking about some of the other species, so some bats, beetles, butterflies, and flies. No studies on hummingbirds or moths, but again, primarily honeybees. If we expand out more broadly and just look at the different species and more broadly thinking about agriculture, we saw a few more studies. So a few of these studies talked about the value of honey as a consumable product from bees. So, thinking about not necessarily a direct impact of pollination, but clearly something very closely related, because that honey comes as kind of a side effect, from the human perspective, side effect of the pollination. Some of the studies that were picked up in the screen also talked about agricultural values from biological control by bats, beetles, flies, or moths. So again, using a fairly broad net trying to catch studies that might be talking about pollination. We're catching a number of studies that talk about species that sometimes are pollinators, but not necessarily the effects that they're producing, or the effects related to pollination per se. Going forward, we were looking at the non-material services, or looking for terms such as cultural services. And here we really found a very small number of studies. There's not much in this space talking about these more non-market values of pollinators. There's a handful of studies talking about, say, recreational values for butterflies and beetles. So that's primarily in the nature viewing context. One study, or maybe two studies, on the existence values, talking about the value, or inferring value from what people would be willing to pay for conservation for monarch butterflies or for a specific type of bat. A handful of studies, two studies, I think, looking at cultural values. Specifically, one was talking about the value of native honeybee keeping, and another talking about not the pollination per se, but the way the pollination supports plants valued by indigenous people living on islands in Fiji. And then a few studies talking about the scientific value of species as natural samplers. And again, a number of these studies aren't necessarily focusing on the pollination. They might be talking about how some pollinators are embedded within a broader food web. So important to be thinking about this broader set of interactions. And then some of them might also be picking up things that aren't really pollinators at all, but they might be a bat that's not a pollinator species, but instead insectivorous, but still picked up in our screen, that we were trying to be as kind of generous as we could to find what is the information out there. Next, we go over to regulating services. And an important point for this, we found almost nothing. An important point for this, and also for the non-material services, is that the potential universe of these studies is actually immense, because, again, going back to the idea that pollinators, one of the first facts that I cited in this talk, or the first fact, was that pollinators are involved in pretty much every ecosystem service out there. So in theory, you can link them. In theory, you could link them to any ecosystem service out there. But the work really hasn't been done to do that in a vigorous way that allows the valuation of thinking about marginal impacts. So potential universe is broad. We might have missed some. I'm sure we missed some out there using this very structured approach of Web of Science. But the fact that we didn't pick them up is just kind of a reminder that this information is not put together in this way. So we found one study, and it was talking about how regulation of water quality was identified as an ancillary benefit in milkweed buffers that were being produced or supported or developed to support monarch butterfly habitat. And so this would be relevant to the extent that the pollination activity actually is supporting the survival of the planted milkweed. So again, it's a bit of a stretch to even include this one study, and I think that helps show that this is not being demonstrated currently in the literature, even though conceptually we know pollinators are very important there. And so the one final point from the structured literature review is that many of the sources that we found in this search, I believe it was something like 2/3 of them, talk about ecosystem services in some way, but they do not move forward to the point of actually valuing them. So 123 of them mentioned ecosystem services, often as a motivating topic, often citing some of those headline results, the value of pollination to agriculture worldwide, but not evaluating the benefits. 12 that we found were review articles that had really great information, but didn't provide novel estimates. And 40 mentioned species more as a pest than quantifying services. Again, thinking about some of the challenge of finding some of this information out there. But really the take-home conclusion from this is that the available knowledge about ecosystem services provided or supported by pollinators is really limited to a pretty narrow domain. That domain is primarily returns to agricultural producers from honeybee pollinators. And so with that, I want to shift gears one more time and now talk about how we situate this and think about this in the natural resource damage assessment and restoration, or NRDAR, context. And so, and again, I'm not an expert in NRDAR. Many of you are much more experts. And for this section, I will be turning more to my colleagues as we really want to shift from this being presentation to discussion. So first, just kind of talking about the big picture, broad ideas. The main role of NRDAR practitioners is to determine the type, quantity, and quality of ecosystem services that must be replaced to offset an injury to these services, and which locations are best to implement this restoration. So with that in mind, we were looking at can pollinators and can this information about pollinator services be folded in? And so the first thing we kind of recognize is that pollinator services are often overlooked in remediation and restoration processes. So ORDA has a few examples within the damage assessment and restoration tracking system of pollinators included in restoration. Most of these relate to specific threatened and endangered species. And so we argue that NRDAR practitioners could consider pollinator services in a suite of ecosystem functions when assessing habitat losses, or when a pollinator is an important aspect of, say, recreational or cultural service losses, things that are already established and recognized within the practice. When pollinators play an important role, thinking back to that complexity of how pollinators can interact with different things, there might be opportunities to think about pollinators in those systems. And so on this next slide, I just have a few different points of considerations or next steps for thinking about for utilizing pollinator services in NRDAR. And I'm going to walk through these, and I'm going to pause between them to allow my co-authors to weigh in if they want to, or I'm happy to keep things going, and we can save that for Q&A. But I'm just going to walk through a couple of these things. And once again, these are all points that we've made in the paper, and we have the citation listed a couple of different places, and so you'll find more discussion there. But really, we think there's a lot to be considered in this context. So first, general ecosystem evaluations might not fully reflect the dynamics of a given pollinator, and this raises questions about how far along the food web analysis we should be considering impacts. And so the important, or maybe an example that helps bring this one to bear is if some restoration has occurred or remediation has occurred in a specific spot, and say there's more floral resources coming. Great. Tim just put the link to the publication in the chat. Thanks for doing that, Tim. So if there's floral resources that are growing in this restored spot, but they might be pulling the contaminant out, we need to, or the question is, how far out in the food web, how far off-site might we be caring about pollinators coming from other locations to this new place? There might be new sources of exposure for those pollinators that may or may not be within the conventional way of thinking about the impacts to the site and the impacts from the restoration. So another consideration is that pollinators might be a crucial factor to understand and manipulate to improve restoration outcomes. And so my understanding of this point is really that, it's one thing to throw seeds out there and hope they go well, but thinking about these broader interactions and if there's going to be any subsequent exposure for pollinator species and what that might mean in terms of behavior or mortality effects, the pollinators and the role that they play in this ecosystem, that could play a really important role in how effective that restoration outcome might be in terms of getting plants established, supporting a broader food web, supporting some of these services like the recreation and cultural services that I noted on the previous slide. Related to that, remediation and restoration project design that improves pollinator services could actually be linked to continuing efforts to increase native plant diversity. My understanding is that native plant diversity is something that practitioners are increasingly interested in making sure we're recognizing, so it's not just saying, let's get ground cover out there, but also thinking about, well, let's get, ecologically appropriate or native ground cover out there so that we're playing a broader role of recovering the ecosystem, bringing it back to whatever conditions it was before the harm occurred. And so similar to the previous point, thinking about how pollinators fit into that story could play a really important role in kind of enhancing that effectiveness of getting those native plants established and getting them to continue over time. So the next point kind of for consideration, though, is that the limited understanding of non-agricultural pollinator services does represent a challenge for assessing and replacing lost pollinator services. So this is where I think we defer back to thinking about or using this type of conceptual model that we laid out, where you have this framework of thinking about how the contaminant really can fold into a broader web of the ecosystem, and then how that can affect kind of a broad web of different services that are provided to people. Thinking about different pieces there and maybe going beyond the more narrow window of agricultural effects from pollinators might be an opportunity to look for more specific examples of how pollinators might be supporting specific recreational values in a specific context or something like that. So it is a challenge that there's this limited understanding, but it also presents an opportunity there's a lot of growth area, I think, for making these connections between different interactions that already people in different fields might recognize these different interactions, but putting them together to really think about how the contamination can be affecting the ecosystem services associated with pollination more broadly. And so another somewhat related fact is that evaluating the replacement of pollinator services requires accounting for the fact that not all pollinator species are equal or substitutable. And it is not sufficient to just say, well, we saw honeybees on this site, so therefore pollinators are taken care of, these native flowers are going to be supportive. there's a lot of different types of species that provide pollination, and some of them are generalists, some of them are specialist. There's a lot of very detailed nuance of when there's complements, when there's substitutes, when these species can stand in from each other. And the more that information, that type of information is incorporated into decisions, the more the things on the left-hand side of the slide here can hopefully be more sound and have more success. And one final consideration is in thinking about offsite restoration projects, proximity to the site of injury might be particularly important when considering the replacement of pollinator services. So again, this is something, it relates back to the first point that I was making in thinking about the relationship. Once you have pollinators, you have this mobile resource that is coming to the site or maybe leaving the site and going somewhere else. And thinking about how the relationship between a restoration project and the pollinators and the role that they have in a broader ecosystem, the physical relationship between those becomes increasingly important when you think about something like pollinators. So again, I think we think there's a lot of promise and opportunity for thinking about pollinators within this context. But these are some of the considerations that we came up with of important considerations for doing that. And so with that, I'm going to jump to my summary slide, and I'm happy to go back to the previous slide or any other slides, of course, in Q&A or discussion. But just to real quickly wrap up, to summarize, we see that there is potential for utilizing pollinator services in the context of NRDAR, but there are many gaps in terms of the relevant knowledge. We know the most about honeybees and agriculture, both in terms of understandings for the ecotoxicology and for the understandings of ecosystem services. So we argue that further syntheses intended for specific applications could increase the usefulness of the disparate sources of knowledge that are out there. And finally, we think this demonstrates that conceptual models can really help the interdisciplinary communication, helping elucidate things like the role of indirect effects, and how that can really improve our understanding of how systems are really interrelated. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and interest and would love to open it up to questions.
James Meldrum contact is jmeldrum@usgs.gov, DOI 10.1002/IEAM.4808. Timothy speaking.
Thanks so much, James. Really appreciate you giving an overview here. And I want to also just say thank you to the whole team that James laid out at the beginning here. It was really a lot of fun working with y'all. And so thank you to Joe for bringing us together, and thank you to Diane for putting such great thought into this. And just want to recognize Diane is going to be retiring in the spring, so we are lucky to be able to get some of her time before she goes on to more fun activities in her life. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Please raise your hand or just speak up if you'd like. You can also type a comment in here, and I can relay that to the team. Well, while we're waiting for people to get their thoughts together, James, I had one that came to mind for myself from here. Looking at the different graphs that you had, with a lot of the discussion or a lot of the research showing that, yeah, there's linkages between ecosystem services, but not that valuation. Is there a way to take that next step for some of those papers, or that's just a call to action for for future papers to take that next step?
It's a great question, and I think a lot of it, I'll give the very academic typical answer. It depends. It depends on what the papers show, but it's an important point because some of them I feel like came really close, and so it might be tying into once they've talked about how something is useful for, some cultural practices, then trying to take the step. And cultural practices is a tricky one because it can be hard to put dollar values on that. And I mentioned that in part because depending on your decision-making framework and the way that you're thinking about things, dollar values aren't necessarily where you need to go. So thinking about an impact, and if there's a way to develop some metric, not necessarily of dollars, because when you're talking about cultural practices and things like that, it can become really sensitive. I think some of these papers can still be used in contexts if they can be used in thinking about metrics that matter. And if you want to be talking about replacement, can you replace the valued thing at a similar rate, regardless of the value of it? So in some ways, our literature review was potentially overly harsh to some studies in that sense. So I think there would be studies out there that could be used in ways to talk about replaceability of resources and things like that. In other places, I think a lot of these studies, and this is kind of what I was alluding to, I think a lot of the pieces are out there in different literatures and different worlds. And I think there's probably a fair amount more low-hanging fruit where things can be stapled together in different models, and thinking about how a contaminant affects specific specific species, and how that specific species interacts with a broader ecosystem, and then thinking about, okay, what are some of the predominant values that we get out of this ecosystem? Maybe it's, freshwater flows coming out of this forest. And maybe those freshwater flows, we can value those. We can talk about how a species plays a role in supporting trees. We can talk about how trees are related to freshwater ecosystems. So the pieces are there, but it's a non-trivial effort to staple them together in a meaningful way. And so, yes, I think a lot of these have potential, and certainly a lot of things that would have not come up in our search because we were looking at things that have done the work of stapling it all together already. So there's a huge universe of studies that could be stapled together. And that's really where, I think we were hoping to provide some of the motivation, maybe through this paper, of saying there might be good reasons that you would want to do this. And if you're looking in a specific context and not approaching it from the standpoint that we did of this general kind of abstract question of pollinators, contaminants, and ecosystem services, but thinking about the contaminant release in this specific site and knowing what the specific values that people have for that site, I think there can be a lot of work done using existing resources to staple those things together, building the conceptual models out, recognizing, okay, these are, they're rising to the surface as important, or, this is an effect, but it's really happening at a very small level that's probably negligible on the whole, so we're not going to put the effort into. So I think there's a lot of information that can be used and assembled in a specific context.
Thank you. We have a question here from Stacy James. And Stacy asks, I'm wondering if it would be hard to include pollinators as an injured resource if you can't prove pollinators are limiting other species or their habitats. For example, there may be adequate duplication of services provided by different pollinator species in a non-agricultural system.
So I think that's a great point, Stacy. And so this is, one of the papers that we cite that I think is kind of important for understanding this is Hanley et al. From 2015, I believe. And they're talking about exactly your point, strictly within the economic context. And this is one of the challenges with a lot of the conventional approaches that you see in the literature that talk about the value of pollinators to agriculture, is that they don't necessarily, there are exceptions, of course, and there's variation within that literature, but a lot of those studies use things like dependency ratios that don't acknowledge this substitutability. And, as I noted on the previous slide, there's a ton of variation in individual pollinator species and how generalized, how much they can be substituted out by another species. or do they have a specific niche in which there's a specific relationship of one pollinator species and one specific flower? And I'm sure Diane could pull out an example if she wanted of cases where that occurs. And so this is where it depends becomes a really important case. There are certain places where I think you're totally right. An injured resource of pollination might not pass muster because there's going to be other pollinator species that can come in and completely replace the service or the benefit there. But in other cases, that's not true. And it's a very unique or specific relationship. And so that nuance is very important to be thinking about individual studies. And going back from the economic perspective, it's also important when you're talking about the value of that benefit. Because it's all where you put draw the box around. What are you trying to value? Is it pollination, or is it an ecosystem overall, or is it an individual species? And the way you draw that box is going to change how the context that you're talking about will affect the answer. So thanks, that's a great point.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add to that too, that we identified in the paper that perhaps some recreational and cultural losses may be more easy to think about in the NRDA context, because if there is a pollinator connection to some of those, that may be a lot clearer to draw that distinction, and why the importance of ensuring that that is available, and also thinking about it in the injury context. John, please join us.
Yeah, thanks, James, for the presentation. I admit I haven't gotten past the abstract of the paper. Apologies there. So, especially if my question is answered in there, but could you speak to any economic tools or software or models out there that could be used in facilitating these sorts of ecosystem services evaluations for NRDAR, including pollinator services, for example, like INVEST?
So it's a really, really great question. And the challenge with something like INVEST is that it uses very generalized relationships. So I think for broad scoping type studies, scoping level analysis, I think something like INVEST, which is, for those who aren't familiar, maybe you all are familiar, is more like a GIS tool where you draw boxes around things, and it can pull in existing relationships, talking about that are based on like distance to agricultural fields and things like that. So on the one hand, it can be useful for scoping. One important piece to that, my understanding of the pollination value in INVEST, is that it's completely related to the returns to agriculture that we're talking about here. So my understanding in the NRDAR context is it's much more about the public goods, the impact of public resources, and not returns to a specific industrial sector like agriculture is. There are mechanisms for linking returns to a sector to broader public goods, but there's a lot of links to be made. Really, at risk of sounding like I'm just making an advertisement, and I'm really not, but that's really where we're an expert coming in to talk about the valuation and the different methods, because it completely depends on what type of ecosystem service you're wanting to estimate values for. And there's survey-based techniques for some of the non-market values, but there's also a lot of techniques where we can infer value from, say, for recreational activities. How much money are people spending on going to a place to do a hunting trip? That's a way that we can infer the value that people get from it. So there's a kind of a whole portfolio, a whole field of environmental economics or natural resources economics that works in this space. And unfortunately, my opinion is that the off-the-shelf tools can be useful for understanding kind of the bounds of a problem, but for actionable information, it'll be somewhat limited. There could be tools out there that I haven't seen, but there's unfortunately not one that I can point to of saying, hey, let's just run with that. But thanks for the question.
Thank you for that. We probably have time for one more question, and it looks like Mary's up next.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the presentation. This was really neat to see. I'm really new to NRDAR, but I have a background in pollinator research. So I was thinking more about the agricultural context, and even within that aspect, which you said is the most studied, you know, it's really hard because I think even for crops that are like completely dependent on pollination, I don't know if you saw anything outside of this, but mostly what I have seen is that the economic assessment is kind of like, if this crop were not pollinated at all, you know, what would be the value of that, right? And so I think it gets a lot harder to find studies that show the threshold at which you start losing pollinator services, you know, at a certain population number. And yeah, that kind of goes back to Stacy's point. But yeah, I think that's really a difficult way. I think that'd be difficult to include that because of that reason.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely agree, and that's, you know, both us and some of the papers that we cite in talking kind of from a critical lens about the existing work that's out there. You know, that said, that's where we thinking about the conceptual model and thinking about, are there other pieces to it that aren't necessarily in the agricultural context? Maybe there is something out there, and frankly, those are the cases where it's more clear, more obvious that there is some sort of specific threshold effect. Then it might be worth looking more into. In other cases, is probably not going to have this marginal impact that becomes really important, as you're saying, in the non-economic framework, which is important.
Well, excellent. I think we'll close it up there. Nora, I see you have one more question in the chat. We'll follow up with you. And if anybody else has any follow-up questions, please reach out to James. His contact information is here, or Diane Larson, Joe Ellen Hill, Inc., or myself. Please, thank you so much, James, for joining us today, and all of you for joining us as well.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.